We need leadership that can be physically present. My husband's voice echoed from the television mounted above my hospital bed, cutting through the rhythmic, steady thud of two fetal heart monitors. I lay perfectly still on my side. The sharp clip of my father's silver fountain pen dug into my palm, grounding me, while medical tape pulled tight against my skin with every shallow breath. The room smelled distinctly of rubbing alcohol and stale coffee, a sharp contrast to the polished corporate stage on the screen. Up there, under the studio lights, Eric offered his brightest, most dependable smile, the one he usually saved for our board members and major investors. He turned to the woman standing next to him, and the camera tightened on Courtney Crawford. "That is why I am appointing Courtney as Vice President of Strategy and Operations," Eric announced. "Not acting Vice President, just Vice President, my title." The graphics at the bottom of the screen confirmed it, flashing her name in bold letters. Courtney stepped up to the microphone, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and placed a manicured hand on Eric's arm. "Thank you, Eric," she said smoothly. "My first priority is to complete the delayed transaction by tomorrow morning." Tomorrow morning. She meant the cold storage asset sale I had flatly refused to sign. My phone buzzed on the rolling tray table. I picked it up, my fingers suddenly cold against the glass. A text from Eric, sent while Courtney was still speaking to the cameras. "Don't embarrass me. This is temporary if you cooperate." A sharp, breathless tightness seized my stomach. I squeezed the fountain pen tighter, feeling the scratched metal where my thumb rested, fighting the urge to throw the phone against the wall. Dr. Lena Brooks pushed through the heavy wooden door at that exact moment. Her eyes darted immediately to the monitors, and she snatched the remote from the bed rail, muting the television. "Look away from the screen, Samantha," she ordered. She pressed her hands against my abdomen, checking for rigidity. "Your blood pressure is spiking, and you cannot afford a contraction right now." "I need my phone," I whispered, my voice rough. I didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for women losing a marriage, and I was losing a legacy. Reaching past the doctor's arm, I dialed the only number that mattered. "Diane," I said the second the line connected. "I am watching the feed," Diane Mercer, our general counsel, replied. Her voice was flat and entirely devoid of pity, which was exactly what I needed. "I am not calling about the affair," I told her, shifting my weight just enough to ease the pull of the monitor wires. "Eric just gave Courtney my signing authority." I saw the title card. Diane paused, and the rapid clack of her keyboard bled through the receiver. "Who officially appointed her? What exactly did the graphics say, and when is the closing?" Eric made the announcement himself. "The graphic," said Vice President, "no temporary modifier. And the closing is 9 in the morning. 9. A sharp exhale rushed over the line. "Let me check the human resources system. Stay on the line." I balanced the phone against my ear and dragged my work laptop onto my lap with my free hand. I typed in my company credentials, hit enter, and waited. Access denied. Disabled by administrator. Switching to my personal email, I found an automated notification from the corporate portal. My medical leave had just been converted to an indefinite leave of absence, and my directory profile already listed me as former vice president. He had locked me out, not just from the physical building, but from the entire operational network. "Samantha," Diane said, returning to the call. "I need the envelope your father left you. Do you have it?" I opened the drawer of my hospital nightstand, moving slowly to protect the twins pressing heavily against my ribs. Digging past my prenatal vitamins, I pulled out the heavy manila envelope I had packed 3 days ago. I slid out the scanned copy of the trust distribution instrument. "I have the scan," I told her. "A scan is not going to stop a 9 o'clock closing," Diane shot back. "We need the stock ledger, and we need the originals from the law office." I looked back up at the muted television. Eric was kissing Courtney lightly on the cheek, a professional, supportive gesture perfectly calculated for the cameras. A victory lap. "Get the originals, Diane," I said, my voice steadying into something hollow and absolute. "I am done asking him to remember who built that company." "Give me 10 minutes, she said, and the line went dead. I lay there in the quiet hospital room, listening to the thumping of my unborn children fill the space where my panic should have been. Eric thought he could use my high-risk pregnancy as a cage. He assumed that taking my email password and handing my title to his mistress would leave me paralyzed in this bed. My phone rang again. "Diane." "Samantha," she said, and for the first time in 10 years, the seasoned attorney sounded completely out of breath. Your shares are untouched. Eric cannot take your vote with a medical memorandum. But he used that claim to lock you out of the company, and he bought himself the night before closing. Dr. Brooks checked the fetal monitors before speaking, her expression unyielding. She explained that the clinical note merely confirmed my alertness and decision-making capacity, nothing more. A medical record did not grant corporate shares, but neither could Eric revoke my ownership through a memo. I did not need a physician's permission to hold voting rights that were already recorded in the stock ledger. The screen of my tablet glowed softly as Diane opened the governance documents during our video call. Her finger pointed directly to the governing clauses. Eric had no power to transfer, suspend, or strip my voting shares with a personal narrative or an executive letter. The voting power had transferred legally on my 33rd birthday, 3 months prior, and remained entirely intact. Eric had bypassed ownership entirely through operational sabotage. Diane walked me through the internal directive he had transmitted earlier that morning. Citing medication, bed rest, and data security, he had issued an emergency access mandate to information technology, human resources, and the corporate secretary. The decree locked my email, portal access, signing token, and operational views without altering a single line in the stock ledger. He understood the law well enough to know he could not steal my equity on paper. Instead, he manufactured a digital quarantine, buying himself complete isolation of corporate records until the transaction cleared. The faint scent of aged paper and dried ink rose from the silver fountain pen resting on my bedside table, unlocking a brief memory. My father had once told me that doors could be locked and networks severed, but a name written in the original stock ledger could never be erased by someone holding a temporary title. I had hidden the transfer agreement for years because I wanted Eric to believe his success came from his own strategy rather than my family inheritance. That very silence had protected my voting majority while blinding me to his preparations. A calendar invitation pinged my personal email, forwarded by a loyal executive assistant whom Eric had not yet discovered. Courtney had scheduled a closing session for 8:30 the following morning. The participant list included Eric, Courtney, Marcus Reed, an external banker, and Walter Crawford. Walter's presence caught my attention immediately. He appeared not as a related party with a controlling stake in the buying entity, but merely as an external advisor providing strategic guidance. Minutes later, an encrypted transmission arrived from Marcus. The file contained only a hash receipt and a short warning note, stating that the preliminary valuation presented to the board differed entirely from the final figures. Attached instructions directed Diane to issue a formal preservation notice before opening the archive. Marcus appeared to be an accomplice on paper, yet he was quietly preserving the chain of custody. Diane executed the preservation notice within seconds, locking down server logs across the entire logistics network. Once the electronic seals were secured, she opened Marcus's encrypted file. The numbers displayed on the screen were undeniable. The preliminary valuation calculated the cold storage warehouses at $140 million higher than the sale price rubber-stamped by the old board. At the very bottom of the preliminary summary, written in Eric's unmistakable handwriting, sat a blunt instruction telling the finance team to reduce the valuation below $400 million before presenting it to the directors. Diane dragged the original valuation next to the final board packet on my tablet screen, and the differences were impossible to ignore. The final document completely erased the lucrative new client contracts our team had secured in March. It slashed the land value of our Chicago facility and assumed a ridiculously low occupancy rate for the upcoming fiscal year. Those were not random adjustments. I recognized the baseline figures immediately because they were pulled directly from a worst-case scenario model I had submitted to the Capital Allocation Committee 6 months ago. Eric had weaponized my own risk assessment to justify a fire sale. At the bottom of the final certification page sat an electronic signature belonging to Marcus Reed. Our chief financial officer had validated the manipulated numbers. I remembered Marcus standing in the boardroom 2 weeks prior, urging the directors to accept the deal because the logistics market was softening. "We cannot trust him," Diane warned, her voice tight over the speaker. "He sent us the preservation notice to cover his own tracks. Marcus might just be building a lifeboat." An incoming video call replaced the document on my screen, displaying Eric sitting in the corporate broadcasting studio. I answered without turning on my camera. "Samantha, sweetheart," my husband began. The gentle, concerned tone coded his words perfectly. "I know the medication is making things confusing right now. You need to sign a voluntary leave of absence. Just let me handle this and protect the babies." "I am not signing anything," I replied. My heart rate monitor beeped faster, betraying my forced calm in the quiet hospital room. His voice dropped its warm facade instantly. "Stress causes premature labor, Samantha. You are putting our children at risk over a business disagreement. Do not make a scene." He disconnected the call before I could respond. A voicemail notification popped up a moment later, followed by a text message repeating the exact same coercive threat about my pregnancy. I saved both files to the secure folder Diane had established. A news alert pushed through at the top of my screen a few minutes later. The headline proudly declared that our chairman was stepping up to save thousands of jobs while his wife faced a difficult pregnancy. Below the text was a photograph of me lying in this exact hospital bed. It was a private picture taken from our family cloud account and leaked to the press without my consent. The article painted Courtney as the brilliant young executive stepping in to finalize a critical transaction, while the emotional heiress wife recovered in isolation. A hot flush of anger burned the back of my neck. I wanted to draft a public statement immediately to expose the fake valuation and the affair. "Do not do it," Diane commanded, reading my silence perfectly. "If you alert him now, he will accelerate the closing before we can establish the new board. Let them think you are helpless for one night." Enduring the public humiliation felt like swallowing broken glass, but the seasoned attorney was right. A premature attack would cost me the entire company. 10 minutes later, Diane patched another call through to my tablet. Marcus had contacted her directly, intentionally bypassing my locked accounts. He confessed to signing the final valuation only because Eric explicitly claimed that an outside advisor had verified the depressed assumptions. The financial officer swore he did not know Walter Crawford was Courtney's father until the calendar invitation arrived that morning. "I have proof," Marcus told Diane, his voice trembling slightly over the audio feed. "There is a side letter. I do not have the complete file, but I secured a fragment before Eric locked the corporate archives." An image loaded into our shared folder, showing a single photograph of a torn physical document. The visible top line promised Eric a massive block of rollover equity in the new holding company. He was selling my family legacy to become an owner himself, but my eyes caught the very last sentence, partially cut off by the camera angle. It outlined a strict termination clause after a 6-month integration period. Eric believed he was the mastermind securing his own empire, yet he had no idea he was actually just a disposable signature. A notification flashed on my tablet, pushing through to an old alias email address Eric had forgotten to disable. An administrative assistant working for Courtney had accidentally forwarded a complete email chain. My husband's words stared back at me in plain text. "Her bed rest gives us the window we need." Courtney's reply arrived 3 minutes later. "Once I have the title, I can sign before she gets a vote organized." The two of them had not just taken advantage of a medical emergency. Eric and Courtney had built their entire corporate timeline around the physical vulnerability of my unborn children. Diane sent the next document into our secure folder. A human resources change request appeared on the screen, marking my replacement as permanent and effective immediately. My husband had stood under those studio lights and lied to the entire company about a temporary transition. Signatures from both the chief executive officer and his mistress anchored the bottom of the page, noticeably missing any formal board resolution. "We need to draft the written shareholder consent right now," Diane instructed over the audio feed. "Do you have the pen your father used the day he signed the trust instrument?" My gaze drifted to the rolling tray table. The silver fountain pen lay exactly where I had dropped it. Scratches marred the metal barrel, and the cap fit loosely after years of heavy use. For years, I had spent so much time running from my inheritance, desperate to prove my own worth, that I had forgotten a crucial truth. Power only matters when you actually have the courage to wield it. "I have the pen," I told her quietly. Diane quickly uploaded 3 candidate profiles for the new independent board. The seasoned attorney presented a former logistics director, an insurance actuary, and a retired corporate compliance prosecutor. None of them were old family friends. And that was exactly what I wanted. The company needed directors who possessed the integrity to oppose me if I ever stepped out of line. Replacing Eric's dictatorship with my own loyal echo chamber would destroy the enterprise just as quickly. I reached for the tablet to review the first background check, but a sharp, blinding cramp seized my abdomen. The pain radiated through my lower back, stealing the breath right out of my lungs. My fingers curled into the thin hospital bed sheets. The fetal monitors instantly registered the spike, sending a loud alarm echoing down the corridor. Dr. Brooks rushed through the heavy door before the third chime finished. The physician took one look at the monitors, reached across the bed, and snapped my laptop shut. "You are having a severe contraction," the doctor stated, her voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You will shut off all screens, lie on your left side, and rest for 1 full hour. If you refuse, we are moving to emergency surgery." The walls of the room felt like they were shrinking. "I just need 10 minutes to finish reading." "You have 0 minutes, Dr. Brooks countered, stepping over to dim the overhead lights. There was no choice left. Handing the entire legal process over to Diane, I closed my eyes and focused entirely on the 2 fragile lives depending on my stillness. This was the real cost of fighting back, and my body was paying the price. When the mandated hour finally passed, Diane immediately reconnected the call. Her tone carried a new, heavy urgency. Eric had realized the preservation notice meant someone was hunting for evidence. In response, he had pushed the closing forward to the very first hour of the morning. Courtney would sign the digital compliance certificate from a private conference room before the sun fully rose. "We only have tonight to finalize the board changes, execute the resolution, and notify the escrow agent," Diane explained rapidly. However, a massive problem just surfaced. The compliance prosecutor withdrew his name. My chest tightened. Why did he pull out? Someone made an anonymous phone call threatening a massive defamation lawsuit if he joined a hostile board, Diane said, typing furiously in the background. "We are missing our 3rd director, and the signing room opens in exactly 6 hours. Marcus Reed offered to fill the empty board seat. "Absolutely not," I told Diane over the secure connection. "Marcus has a massive conflict of interest, and the lender will tear his appointment apart." Diane did not argue. The seasoned attorney simply added a new profile to our shared folder, Evelyn Grant. Our former chief risk officer had been pushed out by Eric 2 years ago because she refused to ignore his aggressive expansion tactics. Evelyn agreed to serve, but only after demanding my personal guarantee that the new board would publish every finding, even if the Sterling family name took collateral damage. I gave her my word. The digital draft of the written shareholder consent glowed against the dark hospital room. Diane needed a physical signature. I uncapped the silver fountain pen, resting the heavy metal nib against the printed document my assistant had smuggled in through the maternity ward. The ink sputtered on the very first letter, leaving a dry, broken scratch across the thick paper. I stopped, twisted the loose cap tighter against the barrel to align the flow, and pressed down again. Smooth, dark ink filled the page. My father had built this company, but in that quiet room, the signature returning the enterprise to its rightful governance belonged entirely to me. Diane scanned the executed consent into the corporate registry, and a cascade of legal resolutions triggered instantly. The written consent formally replaced the board of directors for Sterling Meridian Parent Holdings. That newly appointed parent board immediately voted to replace the governing body of the operational subsidiary. Then, the new subsidiary directors convened via an emergency video conference. They passed 3 unanimous motions. Eric and Courtney were suspended, pending a full investigation. Their signing authority was revoked entirely. A formal stop instruction went straight to the escrow agent and the primary lender. "The resolutions are active," Diane confirmed, a rare note of satisfaction vibrating through the phone speaker. "We beat the sun." 40 minutes later, Courtney Crawford opened her digital packet inside the downtown signing room. The audit trail proved she used her secure token to execute the transaction compliance certificate. She either ignored the system warning, or she simply assumed she could outrun it. But she lacked the authority. Our board resolutions had taken effect before her fingers ever touched the keyboard. Her false certification regarding the related party conflict did not complete the sale. The document simply became an irrefutable piece of evidence proving her intent to commit corporate fraud. Escrow froze the transfer, and the lender locked down the funding. Eric remained completely oblivious. He stood under the bright lights of the morning broadcasting studio, preparing for his live interview regarding the leadership transition. I watched the muted feed on my tablet. The newly appointed corporate counsel walked straight onto the set, completely ignoring the makeup artist. "Your wife, the heiress owning 51% of the parent holding, just fired you," the lawyer announced. Eric froze. Every practiced muscle in his face simply stopped working. Courtney stood slightly behind him, still wearing her glossy visitor badge, completely unaware that her newly acquired title was already worthless. Another file dropped into my secure folder. Marcus had finally managed to extract the complete side letter from the restricted archive. Diane read the crucial paragraph out loud. Walter Crawford possessed a unilateral right to terminate Eric after a 6-month integration period and cancel every single share of his rollover equity. He sold my family legacy to become a king, I whispered, staring at my husband's frozen expression on the broadcast feed. They only needed him long enough to sign away the castle. My phone vibrated violently against the plastic tray table. Eric was calling. I answered on the first ring, pressing the cool glass to my ear. "Samantha, you have to listen to me," Eric pleaded. His voice lacked all its polished arrogance, sounding frantic and breathless. "Courtney and Walter are stealing from both of us." Before I could speak, an email notification chimed. Eric had sent a document labeled Mutual Protection Agreement, begging me to sign it so we could hide the transaction and avoid federal prison. I scrolled straight to the final page. A signature line waited for my name, but my eyes locked onto the document properties. The file creation date proved he had drafted the agreement 2 entire weeks before I ever went into premature labor. The metadata glowing on my tablet screen told a colder story than Eric's panicked voice. He had created the Mutual Protection Agreement 14 days ago, long before the hospital monitors, the bed rest, and the sudden corporate emergency. Diane reviewed the file through our shared connection. "It holds no legal weight without your physical signature," the attorney said, her keyboard clacking softly. "But look at Clause 4. I scrolled down. The document reclassified my husband's payout as consulting compensation. Worse, a perfectly formatted paragraph required me to state that the parent board possessed full knowledge of the buyer's beneficial ownership. If I had returned from medical leave quietly, Eric would have forced me to sign this paper, retroactively validating his fraud. My early hospitalization had simply forced him to pivot and use Courtney instead. "We need him talking," Diane instructed. "Call him back. Do not make accusations. Just ask about Walter." I initiated the dial through the firm's legally retained conference line. Eric picked up immediately. "Samantha, thank God," my husband exhaled, his breathing ragged. "We have to fix this before the escrow agent triggers a federal review." I kept my voice perfectly flat. "Why does Walter Crawford hold a termination clause over your employment?" Silence stretched across the connection. Then, a sharp, bitter laugh echoed through the speaker. Eric lost his grip on the devoted husband persona. "Walter promised me the chief executive seat for the new holding group," Eric snapped, the anger finally bleeding through. "Courtney just handles the paperwork. She was supposed to push the compliance certificate through, and we were supposed to walk away clear. A confession, caught on a legally preserved line. But the man I married was not finished." "You are destroying your own family," Eric whispered, shifting his tactics seamlessly. "Think about our children. Do you really want our twins growing up knowing their mother sent their father to federal prison over a business dispute?" My chest tightened. The monitors beside my bed picked up the sudden spike in my heart rate, emitting a rapid warning sequence. A terrifying vision of courtrooms and shattered family holidays flashed behind my eyes. Dr. Brooks stepped into the room, tapping the monitor screen twice with a stern expression. I closed my eyes, forcing a slow breath into my lungs. Taking down the architect of this conspiracy mattered, but protecting the 2 fragile lives inside me mattered more. I would not let him use my children as a psychological weapon. "I am not the one who gambled with their future," I said, and disconnected the line. Diane called back 10 minutes later. The new board of directors had just concluded a preliminary interview with Marcus Reed. Our chief financial officer was not a flawless hero, but he had chosen self-preservation over perjury. "Marcus preserved the original valuation," Diane reported. When Eric ordered the numbers depressed, Marcus established a locked legal archive. He saved the side letter and the email chains. The board suspended Marcus pending the final investigation, but his cooperation provided the exact chain of custody we desperately needed. My personal phone buzzed against the mattress. A text message from Courtney Crawford lit up the glass. "Eric is going to blame everything on me. If I give you the shell company ledgers, will you guarantee immunity?" The mistress wanted a life raft. I typed my response carefully, knowing every word would eventually reach a prosecutor's desk. "I do not control the federal government. I can only promise to submit truthful documents." 3 heavy minutes passed. The typing indicator flashed, vanished, and flashed again. Finally, an image loaded into our message thread. It was a photograph of a banking interface for a hidden corporate entity. A wire transfer originating from the Northridge Infrastructure Fund sat clearly in the completed column. The memo line read, Phase 1 Advisory, but the routing details told the real story. The money had not just gone to Courtney. The transaction split into two separate recipient accounts. The second beneficiary was listed simply as EV. The new board of directors hired an independent forensic accounting firm immediately. I did not need to understand complex financial jargon to comprehend the betrayal. Diane simplified their preliminary report during our midday briefing over the secure video connection. The wire transfer originated from the Northridge Infrastructure Fund. It landed in a holding entity called Crawford Strategic Advisory. From there, the money split into two branches. Half went directly into Courtney personal accounts. The other half funneled straight into Vandenberg Consulting. My husband had quietly registered that secret corporation 6 months ago. Furthermore, a compliance file pulled directly from the lender exposed the ultimate beneficial owner of the purchasing vehicle. Walter Crawford held total control. The board packet Eric presented had explicitly described the buyer as an independent infrastructure fund. That was a material, calculated lie. A new audio file appeared in my secure messages. Courtney had forwarded a recorded voicemail from her father. I pressed play, listening to Walter calm, measured tone echoing through the sterile hospital room. Do not act foolishly, Courtney, Walter warned on the recording. If you cooperate with their new board, you will lose everything. I will simply tell the federal investigators that Eric manipulated you. You are entirely replaceable. Her own father viewed her as a disposable asset. The screen of my tablet refreshed with a high-priority alert from Diane. Our corporate technology manager had just forwarded an urgent directive from Eric. My husband was demanding the immediate decommission of Courtney Company mobile device and a total wipe of her email inbox, citing a sudden security breach. The timestamp proved fatal. Eric sent the destruction order 3 hours after Diane issued the formal preservation notice. Attempting to complete a fraudulent sale was one crime. Actively ordering the destruction of evidence crossed directly into federal obstruction, but Eric still knew how to strike at my personal life. My divorce attorney joined the secure call an hour later, confirming my husband had filed an emergency motion for temporary access to our shared townhouse. A fresh press release hit the financial news networks simultaneously. The public statement accused me of using a difficult pregnancy and corporate bureaucracy to wage a bitter revenge campaign against a devoted husband. My jaw tightened until my teeth ached. I wanted to release every detail of the affair to the media immediately. Stay focused on the corporate fraud, Diane advised sharply. Your marital agreement from 2018 is ironclad. The prenuptial completely isolates your parent company shares, your trust distributions, and any inherited asset growth. Eric cannot touch your family legacy. The house and the joint accounts will be settled in family court. The seasoned attorney offered the exact grounding I needed. Releasing a scandalous statement would only validate his narrative of an emotional, jealous wife. Silence remained my strongest weapon. Late that afternoon, Diane called from the downtown law office. Courtney Crawford had just walked through the glass doors accompanied by her own defense attorney. The former executive placed her corporate phone, her laptop, and her digital signing token directly onto the mahogany conference table. She is not asking for forgiveness, Diane reported. Her exact words were that she signed the compliance certificate, but she was not the first person paid. The mistress had finally realized the men in her life intended to let her take the entire fall. Diane began extracting the forensic image of the mobile device. 10 minutes later, the attorney uploaded a specific text message thread to our shared folder. The message came directly from Walter Crawford, sent the night before my hospitalization. If Eric panics, use the signature page I provided, Walter wrote. She never reads what she signs when she is scared. Attached to that text message was a pristine, high-resolution document. I opened the file. It was a blank authorization form, but the bottom corner held my exact, authentic signature, perfectly cropped from an old corporate approval. The morning financial broadcasts ran the leaked story before the sun fully cleared the Chicago skyline. A high-profile defense attorney representing my husband had transmitted a digital document to the new board of directors, and copies conveniently found their way to the press. The Mutual Protection Agreement. The final page bore a signature that looked exactly like mine. According to the talking heads on television, the wealthy heiress had approved the warehouse sale all along, only choosing to weaponize corporate governance out of jealousy after discovering an office romance. I stared at the document on my tablet. Panic tried to crawl up my throat, but Diane Mercer had already initiated a defense. "We do not fight this with press releases or denials," the seasoned general counsel instructed over our audio link. "We fight this with chain of custody." An independent document examiner and our digital forensic team pulled the source file apart within 2 hours. Diane shared their technical report directly to my secure folder. The signature had not been forged by hand. It was lifted directly from a routine vendor approval I had processed 8 months prior. The compression artifacts, the microscopic scan marks, and the exact pixel placements matched perfectly. Furthermore, the creation log proved someone generated the fake document on Courtney Crawford's corporate laptop entirely after my hospital admission. A secondary detail caught my attention. I zoomed in on the stolen image. Whenever I used my father's silver fountain pen, the heavy metal nib always left a tiny, distinct pool of ink right beneath the capital letter of my first name. The pasted signature lacked that mark completely, proving I had originally signed the vendor form with a digital stylus. It was a minor detail, but it anchored the forensic evidence in physical reality. Dr. Lena Brooks allowed me exactly 30 minutes for the emergency board hearing. I propped the tablet on my tray table, adjusting the camera angle to hide the hospital monitors. Eric appeared on the video conference, sitting beside his new lawyer. My husband wore his finest tailored suit, projecting the image of a reasonable executive enduring a vindictive spouse. He launched into a prepared statement about my emotional state and my supposed desire to destroy the company over a personal grievance. Diane let him finish. Then, she systematically dismantled his entire corporate existence. The general counsel presented the source document for the forged signature, followed by the file creation logs. She dropped the digital audit history into the virtual meeting room, proving the compliance certificate was executed long after authority had been revoked. Finally, Diane displayed the forensic tracing of the wire transfer. Eric lost his practiced composure, but the final blow did not come from our attorney. Marcus Reed unmuted his microphone. Our chief financial officer testified that Eric had explicitly ordered him to backdate the board minutes, attempting to make the temporary vice president appointment appear legitimate. Marcus had refused to sign the fraudulent minutes and preserved the emailed instruction in his legal archive. The screen displayed the secret side letter next. Diane read Walter Crawford's termination clause out loud, exposing the reality that Eric was never going to become the chief executive of the new holding group. My husband stared at the screen, his face draining of color. He turned his chair violently toward Courtney, who had dialed in from her own attorney's office. "You handed them the internal drives," Eric shouted, abandoning his lawyer's restraining hand. "You sold me out to save yourself. You and Walter drafted a document to send me to federal prison," Courtney fired back, her voice thick with panic and rage. "Do not pretend you were protecting anyone but yourself." The alliance shattered right there on the recorded conference line, breaking apart under the weight of their own documented lies. Walter had created that forged signature as an insurance policy, fully intending to frame me if the transaction triggered a federal investigation. Before Diane could call for the final board vote, a sharp, piercing alarm erupted next to my bed. Dr. Brooks sprinted into the room, her eyes locked on the fetal monitor. One of the 2 heartbeats had suddenly plummeted, dropping dangerously out of rhythm. "Clear the room," the physician shouted to the nursing staff. She looked at me, her face pale but determined. "Samantha, drop the tablet. We have to move you right now." The emergency disclosure document waited on my screen, requiring one final authorization to lock Eric out permanently. A single click stood between me and total corporate victory, but another alarm pierced the air, frantic and entirely merciless. I dropped the silver fountain pen, let the tablet fall to the floor, and grabbed the rails of the hospital bed. The blinding fluorescent lights of the surgical suite blurred into a solid white ceiling as they rushed me through the swinging double doors. Dr. Lena Brooks worked with terrifying efficiency, barking rapid orders to the nursing staff while adjusting my intravenous medication. My vision swam, but the steady, returning rhythm on the fetal monitor anchored me to the room. The crisis eventually passed. Surgery was averted. I would spend the next few weeks confined to that hospital bed, heavily monitored, but my children were safe. Meanwhile, the corporate machine moved forward without its heiress. Diane Mercer executed the emergency disclosures using the authority of the newly seated board. Our legal counsel proved that a functioning system did not require a savior, it only needed rules. 3 weeks later, 2 tiny girls arrived safely into the world. Standing in the neonatal intensive care unit, I let my daughters wrap their miniature fingers around my thumb. The plastic incubators hummed a quiet, steady lullaby. Their father was nowhere near the maternity ward. Temporary parenting boundaries restricted Eric to updates transmitted strictly through our family law attorneys. He did not get to play the worried patriarch for the cameras. 6 months slipped by, measured in midnight feedings and endless legal depositions. The internal investigation finalized its findings, transferring mountains of documents to federal prosecutors. The justice system moved slowly, utilizing grand juries and subpoenas rather than sudden arrests. I officially resigned from my vice president role, taking a limited position as executive chair and appointing a completely independent chief executive officer. Courtney Crawford broke first. Facing decades in a federal facility, the former executive signed a comprehensive plea agreement. She surrendered the shell company ledgers, authenticated the text messages, and testified under oath about the forged signature page. During her deposition, Courtney confessed a crucial detail. Eric had confidently assured her that I would never expose the fraud, because protecting the Sterling family reputation mattered more to me than my own marriage. He had miscalculated terribly. The family court dismantled our 8-year marriage with surgical precision. Our 2018 prenuptial agreement performed exactly as designed. The judge confirmed that my parent company shares, trust distributions, and inherited assets remained entirely separate property. We sold the Chicago townhouse. My original down payment returned to my accounts, and we divided the remaining equity according to the contract. Mutual waivers blocked any requests for spousal support. Eric lost his massive, unvested equity packages, but not because of a vindictive divorce decree. The logistics company simply canceled the shares following his termination for cause. Child support and custody arrangements proceeded on a separate track, governed solely by what served the twins best. Walter Crawford faced his own reckoning. The limited partners of the Northridge Fund ousted him from the managing partner seat. Civil claims piled up rapidly, accompanied by federal indictments for wire fraud and obstruction. His empire crumbled piece by piece, dismantled by the very paperwork he used to build it. Eric attempted one final negotiation. His defense team offered a guilty plea to reduced charges. In exchange, he demanded I waive my right to read a victim impact statement and allow him to frame the divorce as a casualty of corporate ambition. I refused the bargain entirely. The federal judge needed to see exactly how the former chairman had weaponized a high-risk pregnancy. The night before his sentencing hearing, a final email arrived from his lead attorney. It contained a private video file. Eric sat alone in a dimly lit room, staring directly into the camera lens. "Please do not read those text messages in open court, Samantha," my former husband begged, his voice stripped of all its polished charm. "Our daughters will hear that audio one day. Do not do this to them." I closed the media player and walked over to the cribs where my 2 girls slept peacefully. Watching their chests rise and fall, I opened the draft of my victim impact statement on my tablet. The document ended with the exact sentence he feared most. Courtney Crawford stood before the federal magistrate, her designer suit replaced by a simple gray dress. The judge delivered an 18-month prison sentence, demanding full financial restitution and the immediate forfeiture of her consulting fees. Reading from the bench, the magistrate noted her extensive education and executive privileges, emphasizing that the stolen vice president title existed for less than a single night, yet the consequences would stretch for years. Eric Vandenberg took the podium next, flanked by his expensive legal team. He had agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and obstruction of justice. The finalized plea carried a 4-year sentence in a federal facility, followed by supervised release and a massive financial clawback. Our logistics company had already canceled his unvested equity packages under the termination for cause clauses, wiping out his corporate net worth long before the family court finalized our marital division. When the bailiff called my name, I walked to the center of the courtroom. The microphone amplified my breathing as I arranged my papers. I did not waste the court's time recounting the infidelity. Instead, I spoke about the thousands of employees working in our cold storage warehouses, the broken trust of our shareholders, and the calculated exploitation of a high-risk pregnancy. Opening the leather folder, I read his exact text message into the federal record. "Her bed rest gives us the window we need," I recited, my voice steady, echoing off the mahogany walls. Lowering the paper, I looked directly at the judge. My former husband used the existence of our unborn children as a tool to commit corporate fraud, and therefore, he cannot use those same children today as a shield to beg for leniency. Following the official adjournment, Eric turned to face me. The cameras were gone, his corporate titles were erased, and Courtney sat on the opposite side of the aisle looking at the floor. The polished facade finally slipped from his face. "I just wanted something that belonged entirely to me," Eric whispered, his voice thin and hollow. "You had a family," I replied, holding his gaze without blinking. "You treated us like assets." Walter Crawford faced his own separate trials, permanently exiled from the infrastructure fund he had built. Sterling Cold Chain Logistics officially canceled the warehouse sale, issued a public restatement of earnings, and established a completely independent committee for related party transactions. Accepting a sharp drop in our annual profits was a difficult choice, but preserving our workforce and repairing the internal governance proved far more valuable to the board. The family court sealed our divorce decree shortly after the federal sentencing. My inherited shares remained exactly where they belonged, protected entirely by the 2018 prenuptial agreement. We sold the Chicago townhouse, returned my initial down payment, and divided the remaining funds strictly by the contract. Eric lost everything he tried to steal, yet he walked away with exactly what the law permitted. A full year passed before I walked back into the corporate headquarters. I never reclaimed the vice president title. Taking a limited role as executive chair, I appointed a professional management team and drafted new bylaws banning family members from holding overlapping operational authority. Diane Mercer met me inside the climate-controlled corporate archive room on the ground floor. I carried a small glass display box containing the silver fountain pen and the original written shareholder consent. Carefully setting the case onto the display shelf, I adjusted the brass label resting underneath. The inscription read simply, "The signature that returned the company to its rules." Turning toward the exit, I took the tiny hands of my twin daughters, guiding their uneven footsteps across the polished floor. "Do you want them to take over the board one day?" Diane asked quietly, watching the girls babble at the bright overhead lights. I looked down at my children, feeling the weight of a generational legacy finally lift from my shoulders. "They can inherit the choice," I told my general counsel, walking out into the bright lobby, "not the burden." You might listen to Samantha's story and think it is just a dramatic tale of corporate revenge, but it is actually a masterclass in self-preservation. When you are facing betrayal, especially from someone who knows your deepest vulnerabilities, your first instinct is almost always to react emotionally. You want to scream, expose their lies to the world, and fight back in the court of public opinion. But this story proves that your absolute greatest weapon is quiet, calculated preparation. Protecting yourself means knowing the rules, reading the fine print, and securing your legal boundaries long before a crisis ever hits. Whether it is a solid prenuptial agreement, a clear division of assets, or simply understanding exactly what belongs to you, paperwork is not just bureaucracy, it is your personal armor. You have to realize that you cannot negotiate with someone who views your existence, or even your children, merely as leverage. You do not win by playing their manipulative games. You win by stepping completely out of their arena and enforcing the hard boundaries they thought they could break. True power is not about fighting to take back a title or a position that someone stole from you. It is about building a secure structure where toxic people no longer have a seat at your table, leaving your children with the freedom to choose their own future rather than inheriting a burden. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic or manipulative situation by choosing cold logic over immediate emotional satisfaction? How did you protect your own boundaries when someone tried to use your vulnerabilities against you? Share your experiences in the comments below, because your survival story might be exactly the blueprint someone else needs to hear today.